Okay, guys, so now we're going to look a little bit more in depth, specifically at the graphs of exponential functions. So let's review what we learned in the last video. So here's an exponential function. Remember that we're going to write it in this form, that a value and that b value to the x power, and this is what that graph would look like. So if we're talking about the a term, remember that a term represents the y-intercept. So it looks like this one's crossing at 1. So if we were to write this function, we would have 1. And then the b term is representing that thing called the common ratio. So that's how that exponential function is increasing. So if we look, we're going from 1 to 3, excuse me, so at 3, and then from 3 to 9. So it looks like we're multiplying by 3 each time. So it would be 3 to the x power. So let's look at this one. It says, consider the exponential equation 2 to the x. The first thing we want to do is graph. So if we're graphing 2 to the x, let's rewrite it as that a times b to the x. In this case, the a value is going to be 1. So that means we are starting at an x value of 1. And each time we're going to double my y value. So if we go to the x value of 1, my y value is now going to be 2. And I'm getting that because 1 times 2 is 2. Then we're going to be at a y value of 4 because 2 times 2 is 4. And then we're going to be at a y value of 8 because 4 times 2 is 8. And then we would be all the way up here at a y value of 16. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to do my best to sketch this. But be careful because we are never going to cross that x-axis. Because if you think about it, if we're moving in the opposite direction, we're taking half. And if we're starting at 1, we're going to take half of that, which would be half. Half of a half would be a fourth, then an eighth, then a 16th, then 32nd, and you would never actually get to 0. So we would never cross that x-axis. The second question is the graph increasing or decreasing? And that's asking when we're moving from left to right. It is increasing, it's going up. And so now we're going to talk about the end behavior. So this graph has 2 ends. It has the right end and the left end. The right end is when your x is increasing. So as our x is going up, our y is also increasing. And then as our x decreases, meaning when we're moving to the left on the graph, what's happening? Well, it is decreasing, but we want to be a little bit more specific. It's not decreasing like straight down. It's actually approaching 0. So we're going to say approaches, can't spell, approaches 0. So we're going to get super, super close to 0, but we are never going to touch or cross 0. All right, let's look at another one. This equation says 1/2 to the x power. So again, let's always rewrite this as a times b to the x. Our a value is imaginary, but there is one there, it's 1. So that means we are still going to start at a y value of 1, but now we're going to take half. So half of 1 would be a half, and then a fourth, and so on. So it's going to be kind of hard to accurately graph on this side. So let's move to the other side. We're going in the opposite direction. We're going to do the opposite of multiply by half, and that would be multiply by 2 or divide by half. So here would be at 2, multiply by 2 again would be at 4, then would be at 8, and it would be all the way back at 16. So again, I'm going to sketch it to the best of my ability. And you'll notice that these two graphs look almost identical, except they're flipped. This one is facing that way, and this one is facing that way. And that's because the previous graph was a whole number raised to the x power. This graph is a fraction smaller than 1. So is the graph increasing or decreasing? Well, if we look, it keeps getting closer and closer to 0. So it is going to be decreasing. And then as our x value increases, meaning as we move right, it is going to approach 0. And then for this function, as our x value decreases, so as we move to the left, our y value is actually increasing or going up. Okay, so let's look at a few more. So here's the next one. It says, consider the exponential equation y equals negative 2 to the x. So again, I want to try and rewrite this as our a b to the x power. So f of x equals, and that negative doesn't go with the 2. That negative goes with our coefficient, which is going to be -1. times 2 to the x power. So that means our starting value is at y equals -1. And each time we're going to double our y value. So if we double -1, then we would be at -2, then we would be at -4, and -8, and then down here at -16. So again, I'm going to do my best here. Sorry. And then it's going to keep going down and down and down. Similarly to the other graph, it is never going to cross that x-axis or 0, because if we move to the left and take half of 2 or half of -1, that would be -1/2, and then -1/4, then -1/8, and -1/16. We would never actually get to a value of 0. So is the graph increasing or decreasing? Obviously, if we move from left to right, it's going down, so it's going to be decreasing. And then as our x values get bigger, so as we move to the right, it is going to be decreasing. And then as we move to the left, it is going to be increasing, but again, we want to use that new term, approaches 0. So it's going to get closer and closer and closer to 0, never touching 0 though. All right, the last one I want to look at is -1/2 in parentheses to the x power. So that means that our a value is the same as the previous problem. It is -1. Our b value is 1/2. And of course, to make it exponential, it's raised to that x power. So we are starting at -1. And we are going to be multiplying by 1/2 each time. So -1/2, and then -1/4, and then so on. So let's go the opposite direction. So the opposite of multiplying by 1/2 would be dividing by 1/2, which is the same thing as multiplying by 2. So -1 times 2 would be -2, then -4, then -8, and then we'd be down here at -16. So when we draw this graph, it's very similar to the previous graph. All that happens is that we flipped it across the y-axis, reflected it. So is the graph increasing or decreasing? Well, it is going up as we move to left to right, very small amount, but it is going to be increasing. And as we're increasing, we are approaching 0. And as our x decreases, so as we move to the left-hand side, our y values are also going down. All right, that's going to be it for this section. Again, please don't hesitate to contact me via email or mind if you have any other questions, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. Bye.